Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology that drives the world's infrastructure. We're talking about healthcare, we're talking about aerospace and banking, amidst many, many other industries. But also check out the Kyndryl Institute, where you'll find unbelievable thought leadership. Many of the guests we've had on the show, you can find both at kyndryl.com, kyndryl.com/institute or .com, where you can find out more about Kyndryl. Today's guest is a previous guest from a webinar we had recently with the Kyndryl crew, and it's great to have him. He's been writing lucidly about AI for several years, and particularly how it's going to affect knowledge work and professional services companies. I was saying to him before we came on air, it was a little bit like that quote where Wayne Gretzky was asked, how does he always know where the puck is going to be? And he said he skates to where the puck is going, not where it is. And that's a little bit what's happened with our guest, because he's been talking about this stuff earlier on. People thought maybe, is this going to happen? Is it real? Now they're listening because they've caught up with the puck. He is the founder of High Output Ventures. He's the author of a brilliant site called Framebreak. Usman Sheikh, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be on. Looking forward to this conversation. Always enjoy these where, like you said, the world of professional work is changing, and there were signs last year, but lots of people have talked about the death of consulting for a very long time. And by no means do I think like there's going to be the death of professional work, but I definitely do think that the way that the firms were structured, the way the work was delivered is fundamentally going to change. And that's what I'm most interested in writing about and talking about these days.
I was having breakfast recently with a senior leader, and I was saying to him that there's two concurrent shifts or multiple shifts going on, but with regards a firm, I was saying to him, like, we're having breakfast, so I picked up a salt cellar, and I was like, the firm used to be like this, like an IBM, and then I pointed to the grains or the flakes of salt that were on his avocado, and I was like, see the flakes of salt there on you? I said, so the firm like IBM had to break up to be more agile and became modular. And then eventually, by doing that, it invited in lots of competitors. And then I poured out some salt on the table, and he was kind of looking at me going, what is this guy going to talk to me about? And I was like, now it's like grains. I said, but AI is, and I took some of the grains and I put them in my glass of water, and it's like, it's dissolving some of those grains, and it's leaving some, it's leaving only very few. And in there, he was looking at me. I was like, did that work? Did you understand what I explained there? And he goes, that's a brilliant way of understanding it. And I was like, oh, yes. So I was like, you've written then about that structure and new structures that are needed. And I thought maybe we would start, well, why was the structure in the first place? And then we'll get on to where you see it going.
I think professional service firms solved the way that they were structured solved a scarcity problem. The firm's most valuable asset was its seniors leaders' judgment, the senior people at the top. But the number of hours in the day were limited, and they could only service a certain number of client requests. In order to solve this problem, what they did was that they put partners at the top and built layers of managers and juniors beneath them so that they could scale their judgment across a much wider array of clients that any single one person could. And I think that became the leverage unit that we see today, and that's why the structure existed. And more than just multiplying the output of the senior leader, what it also did was at the base of the firm was the profit engine of these firms as well. So the rate that the firm would charge for the work versus the rate which they paid the base, the delta between that was the margin. And the wider the base became, the more money the firm made. And also the people at the base of the firm were actually very profitable units of margin for the company, and therefore it expanded its way outwards. So two things came out of the pyramid so far. One was leverage of the senior talent's judgment, and the second was the profit and the margin. And the third thing, which I think is not talked about as much, is that the pyramid also was the training ground for the next generation of leaders and signers at the company. So when you have a wide base, you can figure out who is good, who is doing the work well, And through a series of error correction, supervision through seniors, these junior people ultimately became the people who could one day put their name on a document and sign it as well. And the beauty of this was that all of this training was paid for the client under the guise of the billable hour. And what AI does is that it pulls all three of these factors, the leverage, the margin, and the formation of talent all together, which then puts a lot of pressure back onto the firm, because if they are to adapt, they're going to have to figure out how to change a model that has worked remarkably well for them for a very long time.
I love the idea of the pyramid and the base and the understanding there that it's a training ground. And then it opens up the question, and I'll go all over the place, man, here. You know how I roll. But I also fear that we've seen this with all these firms, that they're not hiring for that base anymore. So I was thinking, like, well, what are they going to do then? Obviously training AI, and, there's some firms bonusing people on using AI or punishing them from not using AI. But then on top of that, I've seen this concept where if you have a senior executive or a senior consultant from one of those firms, they're creating a digital twin version of that person.
Right.
And then that person may be let go in the next few months or years, but there's this digital twin. So you have frozen that knowledge at the start, at the
Yeah.
top, and then maybe actually filling in through sources of information, new papers, etc., your future work that you're about to publish in the future, stuff like that feeds it. And
Yeah.
then you have this just an LLM perhaps that is owned by the firm.
Yeah.
I know that's not exactly the right language to put on this, but that's the concept that we're seeing out there as well.
Yeah. So I think that you correctly outlined two parts. One was the digital twins of senior leaders, which we can park on one side. And the other part, which I think applies more to the formation base, which is that if you stopped hiring as many juniors into the firm, you don't create a problem today in the market, because you can hire from other firms and other people from the stock that exists today. But maybe 5 years from now or 7 years from now, the market is going to face a glut of that talent, which does not exist. So I think I really thought about the formation problem quite a bit. And let's talk about the junior problem first. So the first thing that I said was that the base of the formation was paid for by the client in the traditional model, because you learned on the job. Now, when the client, let's say, does not get billed for hours of work, and they just get billed for, this is the outcome that I would like, and you have to figure out how to bill that for them, you take that abstraction away from the junior base. And now what the firm has to do is make an intentional decision as to whether they are going to invest into the formation of talent in the future. And I'll tell you from personal experience, we have an IT services company in the portfolio. And this is a discussion we regularly have, because it just takes a long time to grow that person, nurture that person into that person who can sign in the future. And the decision now is, shouldn't we just hire someone from the market who is mid-tier and sort of like pay them a little bit more, but augment their output with AI? And I think this is a very intentional decision that someone is going to have to make. Because I have friends who are working on building simulators for junior talent at some of these firms. That, okay, so if you're not doing the work, they're simulators. In one of our firms, what they make the juniors do is that when the output comes out from the LLM, the junior has to assess the output, and then, without seeing what the senior or the system would recommend, and then they cross-triangulate, and they're doing all of this work. So all of this stuff is happening right now, but who's paying for all of that development? It's the firm is paying for that development. And I think, like, it's the correct choice for the firm to actually set some budget to do this, because they set themselves up for durability of competitive advantage in the future. Because let's say that we do all of this and we skip the thing. 5 years from now, we don't have a new stock of signers. We can't afford new signers or senior people in the market anymore. The firm, unfortunately, may have harvested profits for 5 years, but is going to find itself in a really tough spot 5 years from now. So I think that's the formation thing. The core, if it is that intentionality or talent formation becomes the responsibility of the firm, and the payoff is much further out, but it's perhaps the correct decision to make in the short term.
I see it exactly the same as a sports team and exactly the same as making some bets in innovation that many don't work out well, but a few may pay for all the ones that didn't work out. But back to the sports idea, because we're in the middle of the World Cup, I'm going to age our episode now, but of course it's about AI, so it's going to age very quickly. But I recently said this about Ronaldo. So Ronaldo, brilliant player, absolute unbelievable respect to him for playing so late in his career and keep going and be able to perform. But there's huge questions over should he been playing. And for me, what that means is he's preventing somebody else from developing. And as a result, and this is the choice of ultimately the coach or the management team, but they're preventing others from growing. And I often think about that. If you have a digital twin, say, of a senior consultant, and you're relying on that versus to what you said, where I have somebody else going through ultimately the struggle that's needed to actually learn, because it's through the struggle of learning. We were talking about some of the papers we read on AI before we came on. I mean, it's a huge struggle to read those papers, to get through, and actually new terminology and terminology you're unfamiliar with. But it's only through the struggle that you actually learn. And one of the things I wanted to say was this concept of the Chinese room that we talk about AI, where you actually like push a piece of paper under underneath the door, and the AI does the work and pushes it back, and you've no idea what happens after that when it was pushed through the door. That more and more, even if you are a junior coming into the bottom of that base layer of the pyramid, many are using AI and not going through the discipline and the struggle of the learning. And in there, you're like, don't know who actually knows what anymore, because all you're ultimately selling is the output. And I think the governance of that is huge, and it can be missed so much because you think you're doing the work, but it's actually the machine doing the work all the time, and nobody's learning.
Yeah. I wrote a post about this and I called it Fluent and Substitutable, which goes to the exact word that you just did, that you use the machine. So I used an example of a firm where the junior was struggling to get to a certain outcome, and they were relying heavily on the machine to produce outputs. And they thought that it's just some iterations that I need to do, a few more button presses, and I get close to that number. And it doesn't work that way, because you've just converted the LLM into a casino or a jackpot machine where you're just hoping that the next button press is going to give you the answer. And while it could happen, I don't think anyone bases their paying their rent on whether the slot is going to pay out or not. And similarly, my advice to that junior was that you have to do the work by hand to understand what the machine is doing so that you can actually grade the output. And if you do those difficult reps, you actually understand what's happening. Because if you don't, then everyone who can use your same prompt, or eventually the machine will just absorb your work. Because if you don't know what's happening, the machine is like, we're both guessing over here, and the machine gets more reps at it than you do, the machine's going to win at the end.
I was thinking of that movie Wall-E, I think it was a Pixar movie, and excuse me for watching Pixar, but one of the animation studios, Wall-E, about this robot, and it's a world where humans don't do very much, and we're all extremely obese because we've outsourced everything to the machines. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of what a lot of people are doing. Where I was talking to a team recently, and they were saying that if, for example, throw this out there, that you're creating policies, huge policies for huge organizations, but actually you're almost just the person punching in the data at the start. and
Right.
it's the machine coming out with the policy. So nobody actually understands the policy, and everybody's working towards those policies. And you're kind of going, there's nuances in there that are going to be missed. There's going to be so many things missed. There's also going to be lots of stuff spotted, but in there, there's a huge threat. So maybe some thoughts on that happening, because it is happening all over the world. Before we go into talking about business process optimization, outsourcing, offshoring, that
Yeah.
many of the professional firms use, and where that fits into all of this.
I think when we look at past moves, such as, like you mentioned, offshoring essentially changed where the work got done. It didn't change anything else. It basically changed the jurisdiction, lower cost jurisdiction, and the work was still done by people, but it was done somewhere else. Workflow software, basically RPA and other aspects, made predictable processes into a structured format within encoded rules. So it changed how you did the work, but within a certain structure. And I think when I think about AI, what it does is that it takes this reusable system, which now can freeze itself from this constraint of rules that were around, and it changes who is doing the work now, right? So it doesn't produce, what I've talked about is it produce judgment shaped artifacts. Like, it doesn't have judgment in it, but it's shaped. Like someone who doesn't know what a good brief looks like will probably think AI has created a great brief, but someone who's created briefs for a living will know, like, okay, this is not a bad brief, but it made mistakes in these 4 areas. And I think like that's how I see AI being very different from the past world, because in the old models, it was still when the machine reached, or when the process reached a certain exclusion that it could understand, you always had to revert back to a senior. But now that is expanded, and you need far fewer people sort of like doing that. And the machine starts everyone off not from zero, but from later in the cycle. And I think that's fundamentally different from past shifts, because it has direct implications on who's doing the work and how the work gets done compared. Because past shifts, a lot of legacy co-owners will say, fortified the pyramid more than anything. They became bigger, like, a center has like 800,000 people, a lot of them in, jurisdictions like India and Philippines, etc. But AI does not necessarily play out that way, because if you just use it as a productivity enhancer, um, I think your long-term competitive advantage deflates very quickly, because everyone will use the same tools to get to the same answer.
You reminded me of an old story Clayton Christensen told in, I think it was How Will You Measure Your Life. He talked about he called it the ship of Theseus. But the whole idea of the ship of Theseus, for those who don't know, is like the ship gets replaced plank by plank. And
Right.
eventually you're kind of going, there's no planks from the original ship left. So what is it still the same ship? And he talked about, well, Dell outsourced more and more of one of their machines out to China, I think it was, with Asus. And Asus then eventually, as Dell kind of went down the stairs from their side, Asus were going up the staircase from their side, building capability more and more and more, and then actually becomes a competitor. And
Right.
we've seen that with BPOs, for example, and actually where you probably see it more, and I haven't seen anybody really call this out, is, for example, some of the European or even a lot of the US companies maybe use India. And now the knowledge work in India is absolutely amazing. The people coming from India are amazing. A lot of the new mortgages here in Ireland are actually Indian people who have moved to Ireland. So we're seeing kind of reversals of that, the same type of
Right.
thing of the outsourcing.
Yeah.
But in there is a huge threat. So we talked about the threat of onboarders, new starters in some of these firms. But then think about the other side. If you have a BPO out in India, or what used to be an emerging market,
Right.
and now I don't need that anymore, there's a
Yeah.
huge ecosystem, a huge house of cards
Right.
that could come tumbling down. Because somebody told me, if you're working for one of these big firms in a BPO over in India, you're extremely well paid by local standards. you're getting Ubers to work, you're living in luxury locally. But if that's gone now, not only do you fall, but so does the actual house of cards that's dependent on you.
Yeah. And it's a major source of employment within the country's base as well. And a lot of their exports are directly linked to this export-based revenue that gets collected back into the country. So it has large macro implications for the country as well. And there's this large narrative shift of like, okay, well, we have all this trained labor, like you said, we're going to convert them into these forward deployed engineers, and suddenly they're going to do this other new types of work. And the reskilling narrative is definitely there. And there's also the conversation that as the professional services work will get cheaper to produce, then there will be a lot more work, and therefore, hopefully, a lot of these people will find employment within that. But I think there's two things in that argument which I want to click into. One is like, invariably, if the answers get cheaper, you're going to have more people asking more answers for it. So that's there. But there are two things moving over here. One is the demand for that unit of work, and the second is the human labor cost to deliver that unit of work, however much is required. And so if the demand rises faster than the human labor cost rises, then employment will rise because you still need more humans in order to fill the thing. But if the human cost falls faster than the demand sort of like rises, well, then the reverse happens. And I don't think it's going to be clear-cut across the entire industry. I think certain service lines are going to still be heavy human labor required, like high-stakes work is not going to suddenly be handed over to the machines because of a lot of things. But low-stakes work, which is heavily checkable, yes, I think a lot of that work is going to be at threat. And the call center industry is a very good sort of like analogy of this. There's a firm called Concentrix, and then I usually compare it to a new firm called Sierra, which provides, again, voice agents. One uses human labor to pick up the phone, and there's a certain cost towards it. And Sierra is multiples in market cap value, and its revenue is growing exponentially. Like, I think they did 100 million, and they reached 100 million in February, and they crossed 200 million in June. So it's basically, the curve is exponential. And what they provide is call center agents for regulated industries. And there are no humans involved in this transaction anymore. And I think like that's where, even when the stakes are higher, you can see the models moving into this. This is just not picking up the phone and booking a reservation for you. This is someone calling up a bank and asking them a complex question, and that's still being handled by an agent today. Just goes to show you that it's not necessary that increase in work is necessarily going to lead an increase in employment, because value capture can either go to the person, to the platform, to the client, or to the firm. So, and that's the hard part in this conversation that I'm finding, like, who captures all of this gain that is going to occur now?
I really want to talk about that. But just on that, what I thought about that before is it's almost like I called it this idea of musical chairs, that game we used to play as kids where the chairs run out. And
Yeah.
if you think about each shift as we've gone through from digital to cloud to today, there's been shifts, but I just don't see where there's enough chairs at the table for people to be all employed when AI is taking so much of the value and actually optimizing so much. And as what we talked about before, it's taken away that bottom layer. So there's actually nobody at the bottom layer starting. So there's no way to get onto the layer at all. And to your point there, the valuation of the firm is based on usually revenue per employee. So one of the examples is Base 44, this company that sold to Wix for 80 million and had 8 employees, one shareholder, 8 employees. And you go, well, if that's the case and that's happening more and more and more, and we're going to see, as I said to Steve before, not two pizza teams, but two slice companies where
Right.
there's enough to feed one person who owns those companies. And it's a lot of the companies you've invested and co-created.
Right.
Where does the employment lie? And, people are kind of going, oh, well, I'm going to get my kid to become a carpenter or go into the trades. You're kind of going, yeah, but who's going to buy the houses and employ them? So
Yeah.
there's a whole ecosystem here that needs thinking about. And the irony, I thought about this, the irony is somebody in government somewhere where is kind of going, this is on my desk now, and they're typing it into an LLM.
Yeah. Yeah. I think yesterday it was a Google DeepMind founder, Demis, who wrote an article on X, in fact, talking about how this massive change happening and how we need a collective response in how to deal with the repercussions that this is going to have on society. Because I think the jury is still out on, is there going to be net employment increase? How are we going to distribute this? I've heard arguments on both sides of the thing, and usually you're arguing your priors. So if you want more employment, then you're going to say, of course, more work is going to create more people, because if my margin unit is dependent on that unit, then I do not want less because it creates a lot more problems for me. But if I'm a technology augmented firm which is using this, I'm going to say the latter. Ramp, in fact, which is this expense card plus now accounting software company, wrote a paper recently where it found that high growth companies, when they adopted AI aggressively, actually saw headcount rise within the firm. But I think like what the paper says in one line was that this is limited to high growth firms in sort of information technology sectors. And so your concern is valid, and I think a lot of people are seeing that. It's just very difficult because I think jobs are a bundle of tasks. And what we spoke about earlier was that if you unbundle the job, there's certain parts of the job that sort of get automated away. And the parts that remain require you to either have high judgment or the ability to have some credential to stand behind the answer. You might have a law background or an audit certificate or a CFA or a doctor. I think that provides you a position, but someone who doesn't have those, it gets put in a very difficult spot. And like the first work that we were doing, so if now firms need to invest in you to build those skills, where it's not a byproduct of how I do the work, that in itself creates tension within the firm. Because do you optimize for the short, mid, long, or altogether, or how do we do? Or it's very uncertain. I don't want to invest now. Maybe I'll invest 2 years from now. And these are all conversations I'm having with portfolio companies, and it's not easy.
I saw this shift when I was a professional rugby player, and I went into the working world in 2008, which was terrible timing if you look at it that way. But I actually purposely went in at that stage because I was like, oh, well, this is going to be difficult, and I may as well go into an environment that's difficult for everyone and
Right.
use the kind of perseverance and the resilience that I'd built up from sport to work in the working world. But one of the places I first saw was I saw salespeople really struggling because before they'd actually worked as booking agents or they were essentially just minding their clients. And now they have to actually sell and they'd actually forgotten how to sell. And
Right.
before we talk, because I really want to share the shape of the new firms, you talk about 5 different structures, shapes that a firm can have and the evolution of those shapes. But the atrophy of those skills if you don't use them. And one of the things I see people, and this is why I was talking about that mental atrophy, that you may become mentally obese because you're not actually using that muscle anymore. There's a huge onus on people to become constant learners or be constant learners. And I know it's one of the motivations behind Framebreak through your writing, my writing as well. It's not only for the audience to share this stuff, but it's actually for me to actually understand it and going through the struggle of figuring out arguments. Does that work? Does it land? My salt, my salt metaphor at the start. Does it make sense? And actually going through the process of that thinking, sleeping on it, thinking about it over several days. And when people are using agents more and more and LLMs more and more and co-working more and more, that all they are this person who shares the information that they've just got from the LLM, even to a point of upload the PDF, give me the main points. But like when you read a book, I used to get this from people to go, oh, why don't you just use one of these summary book, like Blinkist or one of these tools to summarize books for you instead of going through. I'm kind of going, whenever I did that, and then I read the book, I used to do both. I'd read it and then read the book. I'd pick out totally different highlights because so much of the book was so personal to my own experience, my prior information that I'd sourced, that I'd build information totally different. So if we all use the same agents to produce the same results, to get the same highlights, there's no innovation in there because there's no spotting anomalies and information that's appealing to you or something that might spark a metaphor for you. And I just think that that's a huge shame. And I wondered what your advice was for people who are, because we're all doing it a little bit, we're tending towards that. What is your advice? What are you seeing as a best use of the tools that are out there?
Yeah. I like the way that you said that, you were doing both. I sometimes use that as a filter of whether I want to read this completely or not. Because also, to be honest, a lot of books these days, especially the newer books these days, they fill a lot of pages, but there are a few ideas that are stacked. So you want to figure out whether you want to go through them or not. But I completely agree with you that there are certain books where just the highlights they abstract everything away from the fabric of how everything stitches together. That if you saw Alexander's business model canvas and you just saw that snapshot and you say, okay, here are these boxes, you put your firm on this, and then you try to figure out how to maneuver it. I think it's quite shallow, but if you want to understand what is the core behind each one of this, how do they each interact, what are the different parts, I don't think that you get that. And that's how I tend to read these days as well. I think certain older books you'll just read through because there's just so much in those books. But especially when I read newer books, I do this where I go to the parts which is also most relevant to me so that I can pick that up. And then if that grabs me, then I'm reading a lot more of the book. And but I don't know whether the audience will see this, but this Mike Kirsten had written this book called Project to Product, and now his book just came out yesterday called Output to Outcome, which is very relevant to what we're talking about over here because we're moving from a society which was driven a lot by output, like especially software firms. Output was the code and everything, but now we're talking about these outcomes. But how do we reorient the firm around the outcomes? And he has a structure in the book, and I read a synopsis of it. Someone that I really respect recommended the book, and here's the book. And I started reading it this morning, and it was a great sort of like read so far because it connects with a lot of things which are relevant to me today. So that's my process as to how I'm doing things. And it's becoming harder because there's just so much to read these days that you have to figure out what's really important.
Seth Godin years ago was saying that he'd put the summary. You know the way you see at the end of a chapter, it usually goes chapter takeaways. That he put it at the start of the chapter, and I
Yeah.
learned through learning how the best optimization of learning is actually if you have a concept of what you're going to learn early, and then you kind of read to almost validate that. But if you're led down the wrong path, so this is what I was saying about the AI could actually lead you down the wrong path and go, these are the salient bits, this is what's relevant. And then
Right.
you read it, you're missing the richness of it, and
Yeah.
when I write, I want to bring the reader on a journey. So
Yeah.
actually, in a way, you're warming up their mind. Like the way I see it is the metaphor is creating like Velcro. And then the idea, which sometimes is complex, is what you throw against the Velcro, and it sticks to the metaphor, and in
Yeah.
there the learning sticks. So
Yeah.
you can't shortcut that. Like that has to go through that journey.
Right.
And it's like when I run a workshop, I kind of do the same thing. You kind of got to go through and bring them on a journey, not too long, but bring them on
Yeah.
a journey where it sticks. But let's talk about the move of the way you phrase this, and maybe we'll qualify and share some of what you mean by this. So as leverage moves towards an intelligence core,
Right.
then different structures of the firm emerge. And there's 5 that you identify. So maybe let's talk about what do you mean by leverage? What do you mean by an intelligence core? And then these 5 shapes that emerge.
Right. Let me go through it quickly. We talked about leverage first when we talked about the pyramid and traditional structures, which the source of leverage was labor. If you wanted to do more work, you would add more labor, and that is how this firm progressed or grew bigger. Now, the intelligence score is essentially taking the learnings of how work gets done. So let's make this real. A client comes and they want us to produce ads for their e-commerce brands, and we have to put them up on Facebook for them and test it out for them. So let's say that we tell the LLM to generate us, here's a brand, here's all this context, generate some ads for us. So the LLM will push the ads out. And now someone with knowledge of both the brands and advertising will say like, okay, let's edit this, let's try this, and let's put this to work. They'll put the ad, there'll be a feedback loop where the ad platform will say, oh, this ad performed well, didn't perform well. Let's say that the ad came back, it didn't perform well, we made 3 tweaks to it, and then the ad did better. Okay, so that's a simple loop that I just created over there that, you could replace that with tax or anything else or a legal contract. Most of the times, you just log the winning ad variation and say, this ad did better for every, and it's just logged in a library or a best practice or a template or whatever. An intelligence score is when the output was created by the machine, someone with expertise was able to make error corrections to it and then was able to assess what happened with it or not. And then they would feed all those error corrections back into a machine which learns all of this. So for all the things that you would discard, this is putting all of that context back into the core. And now the next time the machine says, oh, here's a health brand which is targeting the same demographic, the next iteration that the machine will produce will be of higher quality because it has some learning feedback loops from before that makes it better. This is when you don't rely on a person for a source of leverage. You rely on the machine to produce this artifact which abstracted that thing. This also goes very close to your digital twin example that you used earlier because, but there's a key differentiation I want to make here. Digital twin is a snapshot of your state of mind today. And that decays at a really fast pace in the world that we live in today. The loop that I'm talking about is this constant flow of information and work that is happening at the firm, error corrections that are happening. And let's say that we've never worked with a shoe brand targeting women in Europe, and today we're going to do that, but we haven't created ads for it. So someone is going to set that up first, do that, put it into the thing, and the core becomes smarter and smarter. Once this works really well, and you can start to orient the entire firm using this to ask it, here's the client, we produce this outcome, can you produce this for me? And it produces output for them. This loop creates, the feedback loop happens, and the firm changes structure because instead of adding an additional person to the team, you can scale work depending on how much demand you can generate and how quickly you can verify the work coming out. And the firm could potentially morph from a pyramid to what I'm calling a ring. And the ring would have the intelligence score at the center, and then you would have this new structure of people around it. And in a nutshell, that's this transformation. And I go through in detail for how it could happen to various models. But I think as an abstraction, this should provide you with an analogy of what I mean by the leverage, intelligence score, and how this new shape comes about.
It's funny you were saying there about you have a snapshot of someone's, essentially their mental quiver at a certain point in time. But what you see also is you see people get to a certain level in organizations and actually stop learning and actually thinking, I have it now. I'm here now. I'm in port. And you're kind of
Right.
going, there is no safe port or safe haven
Right.
with knowledge anymore. You have
Right.
to consistently learn and find a way to learn, which is why learning how to learn is so important, and unlearn stuff as well, because that, I think that's where people have dug their own grave in a way with AI, in that you got to be the one who's constantly provoking yourself to learn, and it's uncomfortable and it's a pain. Like I was saying, like some of the papers we read are boring, like they're
Right.
tough academic reads. They're tough to get through, but it's only by doing that that you actually can learn and challenge your own thinking as well. But
Yeah.
you mentioned there, so the shape changes, the
Right.
economic gain then shifts. And
Yeah.
so you were saying earlier on about, okay, the amount of effort I put in versus what's output is my profit, essentially my margin.
Right.
But there's a surplus created by AI, and then maybe the client's kind of going, hey, wait a second, you've
Yeah.
been learning on my dime.
Right.
You've created value on my dime. So how do we partition out this new value that's been created essentially by this new party, this new entity, this alien AI?
Yep.
Where's my share in that?
Yeah. And it's happening. I call it the AI discount, which is happening. And, if firms like KPMG can go to its auditor and say like, hi, so I think that I should get a discount on my audit, which was highly reported, it shows that clients are definitely thinking. So let's talk about the surplus. So we now, let's say, with the help of this technology, can produce those outcomes using less hour, less time to produce the same output. In the short run, let's say clients don't adapt, but ultimately clients will start asking the question that, hey, you know, you must be using some sort of augmentation, so I should get a discount. And so the surplus drains in a few ways, but there are two primary ways. One will drain to the client, and it will drain to the client when the work can be easily checkable and the stakes are relatively low. And that work drains very quickly because the client's like, uh, you're doing this, but I could get this model to do this, and I can also test it. So, it's only when the stakes rise, where the cost of being wrong is wrong, that they'll come to you, but they'll still argue with you on this discount. The second leakage is now you have the new cost of the business is using a model, a frontier model, a harness or a control plane to get your answers out of. Basically, you have to use either you use your own platform or you use someone else's platform to generate these answers. And that platform owner, depending on their position, is also going to extract their rent out of the surplus because they're like, hey, you use these many tokens. Guess what? You owe me this much money. Or we have a firm that I'm working with which sells something called routines, which are loops that they sell to small businesses. And they say, we don't charge you any difference on top of the token cost, but every time you run this loop, we're going to charge you a small amount of money. And that's again an example of rent extraction coming out of to the platform that you're losing money to. And over the last 2 weeks, there has been a lot of talk by the CEO of Palantir and lately Satya from Microsoft, which are saying that you need to become sovereign in how you deal with your data, how you deal with the models, how you host them, and you've got to do this. And while both of them are arguing from their priors, because they're both saying, like, listen, you could use the Microsoft platform, you could use the Palantir platform, but they're really scared that platform capture happens from the frontier models who will then sort of like cut them out. And that is going to be the challenge. And that's where it leaks out. Where the rent is slow to leak out is where the output does not have a quick answer back. Like, let's enter China. I don't know. Or let's launch this new product. Will it be successful? I don't know. And we'll find out in a couple of years. And the cost of being wrong is really high. In those situations, which is traditional MBB strategy work and all of this, I think it's going to be slower, or let's say audit companies for Fortune 500. I don't think that their rent will go very quickly because very few people can do that work. And so your position in the marketplace is going to depend or decide on how much of that surplus you keep. If you're competing in a place where you get answers back very quickly, the work can be checked, the stakes are relatively low, you're going to be in a world of pain unless you figure out these locks that I talk about, which can defend the business. Otherwise, you get competed or deflated away in this environment.
I'm loving your new vocabulary, man. You're introducing around this value drain and etc. These locks, almost like a moat of the future. A lock is smaller than a moat because the companies are smaller as well. And to that point, maybe we'll finish on this. So, if delivery of a firm moves from labor and that bottom base, the structure of the org like that, to computation essentially,
Right.
how does a firm intentionally produce the next generation? And remember when we did a webinar recently with Kindrel and Ismail Amla, he mentioned this. He's like, going, imagine you have a review, you have a feedback review, and it's with an agent, and you're treating this agent like it's literally like a colleague.
Right.
And it came to mind when I was thinking about this. Well, how do I both create that new bench for the future? Because actually, when you look at books like, for example, Stall Points, a book about when companies get to these points of stall of revenue, what was the failure? And 87% of companies, it was an internal reason. It wasn't 13% was actually regulatory change, socio-political landscape, stuff like that. 87% was internal. One of them was a talent bench shortfall. So no future talent that we talked about, that academy, like the Ronaldo story, that was able to carry the new strategy for the future. So you may come up with a new strategy. We saw this in the shift from analog to digital in many companies. For example, media companies, nobody had social media literacy. They weren't digital natives. So you had this period that was this messy middle of transition.
Yeah.
What are we going to see in an AI world with that, particularly with professional service firms?
I think in the short run, it's going to be really difficult for smaller firms to build this bench out, because to build a bench, you essentially need to make an investment. And when the investment was subsidized by the client, you were fine. Like, I have lots of friends who run very large software companies, or but the way that I worked with the junior came in, they error corrected, they figured out how the supervisor made the adjustments and the error corrections. And ultimately they got harder and harder work, but it was all paid for by the client. Now we're talking about a world where that assumption is no longer true, and the firm needs to make an intentional decision whether or not to invest in a bench. And I think mechanically it is very possible. I have friends of mine who are running a simulation company, which provide simulation tools for companies to at least get juniors started off, from 0 to 1, and run through the simulator. They allow you to quickly get started. But I think like the next layer on top is something called shadow lanes. And I've written quite a bit about this, but essentially mechanically it is very possible in this new world to do this. That just comes a cost to get it done. And I think that's going to be the true decider as to whether or not leadership today has the incentive to do that if they're optimizing. Because let's say that you are in a partnership and you're going to leave the partnership in 3 years. Are you going to invest in developing a brand new set of talent? And I read something recently about Cognizant and some of these large BPO firms. They're actually making some headways into this by making very large investments into this pool today. And I'll be writing about that soon. But I can see firms intentionally sort of like betting with us, because you have to take margin. And especially for a publicly traded firm, that means you're going to make less money today, but hopefully you're going to pay off it in the later day. And this all comes down to incentive structures as to whether firms are going to make this decision or not. And fortunately, the onus therefore falls on the junior to try to figure out new ways how to run apprenticeships. But within the firm, it is incentive discussion more than anything else over here.
It's a funny time, man. I always think about that term, the French term, après moi le déluge, which means after me the flood. So you have partners and firms coming towards retirement. There's no incentive for them to go and reinvent, reshuffle, reorganize the entire organization. So it's a really messy, messy time. And thank you for providing shedding some light on it for people who want to find out more about Framebreak, about your work. Where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, I think it's framebreak.com, and I write weekly over there. And a lot of the concepts that we talked about over here are discussed on the blog in great detail. I sometimes write on LinkedIn as well. And those are the best places to connect. And I look forward to sharing more in the coming weeks as I get closer to releasing a lot of the thesis work that I've been working on.
And for those who enjoyed this, who learned from it, I hope you have. I'm also learning. I told you I'm putting these building blocks in place, learning, looking back over old, like really early books like that, design rules books, really helped me understand more. Difficult to read. I told Kim and Carlos Baldwin that it was difficult to read, but really worth the struggle to get through. But the good news is, for me anyway, I'm going to be collaborating more with Usman in the future. We might have a special series coming out, or podcast, standalone podcast, but we'll be collaborating in some way in the future, and really looking forward to that. Finally, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology for the world's leading businesses and industries. They work in aerospace, they work in healthcare, keep propping up some of those massive industries, and it's a pleasure to have them as sponsor of the Innovation Show. You can also find the Kyndryl Institute, where you'll find brilliant authors like Usman and many of the guests that we've had on the show before. You can find that at kyndryl.com/institute. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Author of Framebreak and founder of High Output Ventures, Usman Sheikh, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.